what we'll talk about now, so we've sort of the first part of the workshop, what we just spoke about was sort of talking about what kind of problems were, and we spoke about the diagnoses, and then we spent most of our time talking about some of the risk factors. What we're going to talk about now have a sort of common jumping off point to make these sorts of decisions about how best to manage a particular kid in a particular situation. Because we're going to be talking about a couple of theories, and this will feel quite dry. So I apologize for that in advance, but hopefully, like we'll bring it to life a little bit with examples. So we'll be talking about a couple of theories today. So social learning theory, we're just really briefly going to talk about modeling or vicarious learning. Then we're going to talk about operant conditioning. So this is if anyone's done sort of a Psych 101, or maybe in your teaching degrees have done a psychology section, you'll be familiar with reinforcement and punishment. And then we're going to bring it all together and talk about reinforcement traps and try to figure out what sort of traps we're in, what strategies we can use, right? So the first thing we'll talk about is this sort of idea of modeling, observational learning, vicarious learning, whatever it is. And there's a little YouTube video here, but I think it's probably beyond what we need to watch it. I'll just sort of talk through it anyway. But it's the idea that all of these things are all about learning. And I say that because behavior doesn't come out of nowhere. So a child does something, adult does something, there's that hasn't just emerged from sort of the primordial ooze or whatever. Behavior happens because the environment has sort of responded in such a way to make that behavioral response more likely. And that process, sort of generally speaking, is like learning. And so this type of learning, this idea of modeling, is really speaking about sort of the concept that a lot of what we or children learn to do comes by observing vicarious what others do. And so this particular experiment, this Bandura's Bobo doll experiment, really involved getting a whole bunch of kids, letting them play with a toy called a Bobo doll. So one of those sort of blow-up dolls that has the really heavy bottom, so when you knock it over, it sort of bounces back up. Bandura filmed these kids playing with the Bobo doll vicarious. They played with him in the ways that you would expect them to play with this type of toy. And then he sat down the kids and got them to watch a video of an adult playing with the Bobo doll and doing so in a particular way. So doing it, namely, in an aggressive way. So hitting the Bobo doll, punching the Bobo doll, kicking the Bobo doll, knocking the Bobo doll over. And then he let the kids play with the Bobo doll again. And what he found was that the way that they interacted with the Bobo doll this time was different to the first time, and it mimicked much more what they had seen the adult, how the adult played with the Bobo doll, right? And not only that is that not only did the kids like kick and punch and hit the Bobo doll, they also sort of escalated the aggressive behavior. So one kid brings in a mallet and starts sort of like hammering the Bobo doll. And so it was this really nice demonstration, I guess, that of this idea of vicarious learning or observational learning, that, the idea of monkey see, monkey do, but monkey do even worse potentially. And I put this in here because I think it's really important to keep in mind that kids are really, obviously, as we know, soaking a lot up from their environment. And I sometimes speak about this with parents, that this can have really ill effects. This is another thing that can make kids more vulnerable if they see, hitting your partner or yelling at your partner or being, rude or dismissive of your partner. Then that's something that they are also there potentially learning, potentially will do. But we can also use this for good as well as for evil, right? And so for parents, for teachers, for adults who work with kids alike, something like a kid watching an adult apologize to another adult and doing it with sincerity and validation can be an incredibly powerful learning experience for that child. And so I put this in here. This is the only thing we'll speak about vicarious learning, to remind us that kids are constantly watching, constantly observing, and constantly learning from what we do. And so we're just humans. We're going to step up. We're going to yell. We're going to do things that we would look back on and not necessarily love that we had done. Kids will observe all of that stuff, yes. But the kids are also going to observe all of the good stuff as well, the reparative stuff, the praise, conflict resolution, the social skills. So just keep in mind that that's a really, really important way that kids learn, and they can learn a lot through that. So the second thing we're going to speak about, the second theory, is operant conditioning. Really basic, sort of distilling it down, this idea of law of effect is that if I do something and then what follows is a favorable consequence, I'm more likely to do that thing again in future. Whereas if I do something followed by an unfavorable consequence, bad consequence, I'm less likely to do that thing again in future. So this is the whole idea of the way that the world responds to behavior impacts how likely it is that behavior is going to happen again in future, right? And so this is something I think we think about a lot as people who work with children, because the way that we're responding has potential then to impact what the child does again in future. And this is where we bring in these ideas of reinforcement and punishment. And I think we use both of those words like pretty casually, day-to-day language, but they have very specific meanings when you live in a like behavioral learning world, right? And so if we're talking about reinforcers, we're talking about something that has increased the likelihood of that behavior happening again in future, right? So the effect that it has on the behavior defines whether the response is a reinforcer or not. And this is key because what's reinforcing for me may not be reinforcing to you. So it's very individual specific. Whereas punishment is a response that reduces the likelihood of the behavior happening again. And once again, what's a punishment for me may be not a punishment for you. And the classic example of this is being sent to an executive office because you don't like doing a particular task. As a punishment, yes, but that might actually be a reinforcer if it's something that the child experiences as a good thing or something better than having to do the task, right? So these things it's not this sort of obvious one for one because you intended to reinforce or you intended to punish that's the effect that it has. What sort of complicates the thing even more is that we can talk about positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement. And once again, we're not talking about positive and negative as in good or bad. We're sort of throwing those definitions out the window. When we talk about something being positive, it means we've added something into the environment. So a behavior's happened and we've added something to the environment. Whereas a negative reinforcement, negative punishment, means that a behavior's happened and we've removed something from the environment. And kids can either experience something being added as a good thing or a bad thing, or something being taken away as a good thing or a bad thing. So we can have positive and negative punishment and positive and negative reinforcement. So we're going to do examples just to really bring this to life. And these examples aren't like my go-to guide for strategies you should use to manage disruptive behaviors. These are more just to demonstrate the point as opposed to sort of giving you ideas for good classroom management, just to demonstrate, right? So using reinforcement first as our example. Positive reinforcement, behavior happens. We've added a pleasant consequence to the environment. The behavior will increase. That's the idea, right? So, for example, a kid who tends to really struggle to complete tasks on time, completes the workshop within the allocated time, gives you the completed piece of work, and you go, wow, this is like a behavior I really want to see more of. So what happens is you say, okay, great, now you have time to play on the iPad because you finished the work before you needed to. Crucially, this child loves playing on the iPad. So experiences this as reinforcement. The idea is then that behavior will increase. So behavior has happened. They finished the worksheet. We've added into the environment the iPad. The idea being that behavior will happen again. So you have another example here of positive reinforcement. You have a kid who isn't super good usually with their social skills or with their sort of people management on the playground, but you see them playing harmoniously and you're like, so good. And so what you do then is after recess, you pull the child aside and you say, I saw you playing so well with your friends. I just wanted to tell you what a good job you did at recess today, being with your friends, right? And so the behaviors happened, what you've added to the environment is praise, added sort of one-on-one attention. And once again, crucially, this kid really likes you. And so really experiences that attention as a good thing. The idea being that behavior will go up. Last example here, I think you have a kid who just out of the blue, spontaneously collects all of the rubbish from the playground, lets you know about it, or you see them happening, and you go, wow, that's like a huge effort. So what we're going to do this afternoon is have some extra time for painting, which you don't usually do because it's like a lot of effort and a lot of cleanup, but you know that this particular kid, if not all the kids, love this particular activity. So you've added into the environment after this behavior extra time, this preferred activity. And you know that the next day, all of their little friends are going to be picking up all of the little rubbish on the playground. We're going to see an increase in this behavior, right? So that's positive reinforcement, which I think you're very familiar with. The idea is a kid does something and you say or do or give something that they experience as a good thing. We are across this. Negative reinforcement is a little bit stickier to define or to sort of recognize how it can shape behavior, because it still increases behavior. So this is when a kid does something and something unpleasant is taken out of the environment as a result of that behavior, which will increase the behavior. So some examples. This first example is where we use it for evil, not for good. So you have a kid who is refusing to sort of get dressed and get in the car and go to school because it's the start of the new year. They miss their old teacher. They don't like their new teacher. They're not into it. They're really upset. So as a result of sort of this dysregulation, this refusal, the big tears, the big feelings, the parent says, that's fine. You know what? One day won't hurt. You can stay home from school. However, and so what has happened here, the behaviors happened, the school refusal, the big tears, the crying, and out of the environment, the parent has taken the request or the expectation to go to school. They've removed that from the environment, which will mean that this behavior will probably increase next time. There's the risk of that. So that's an example of negative reinforcement of something bad being taken out of the environment, which may increase the behavior. And in this case, it's not necessarily a behavior we'll see more of, right? Another example is that you are sort of like it's free play and it's time to transition into another activity. And so you've told a child, it's the end of free play, it's time to put all the Legos back in the box. Please put the Legos into the box, right? Child ignores that request, continues playing. And what happens is that the teacher then moves on to tell the next child their instruction of what they need to pack away. And so the original child has more time to play. So what happens in this sort of little interaction is a small case of negative reinforcement, where the ignoring behavior of child to teacher has been negatively reinforced, even if only briefly, because that instruction has also been removed, even if briefly or temporarily, from the environment. And so there's been more opportunity to play. And so chances are perhaps we will once again get this sort of ignoring behavior in response to this sort of polite request to put the Legos away. Once again, negative reinforcement, reinforcing a behavior we might not actually want to see more of, right? Another example here, you have a child who gets frustrated with the person who they're sitting next to, and this is a child who usually kicks off in response to that, gets upset, yells, maybe get aggressive with this person. And instead, this child has remembered their problem-solving plan and has come and let you know that she's being bothered by the person sitting next to her instead of kicking off, right? And so what happens then is that the teacher goes, thank you so much for telling me, that's fine. I'm going to move the person sitting next to you to somewhere else. And so what happens then is that the behavior, telling you, letting you know, is followed by removal of that really negative experience, that unpleasant thing from the environment. Hopefully then that will increase that behavior. So unlike the other examples, this is an example of negative reinforcement that is being used for good, where we might want to see an increase of this behavior over, the alternatives, which would be physical or verbal aggression, right? So something's being taken out of that environment that a child experiences. So that's reinforcement. So that's all about how we see more of behaviors. And what I think we'll talk more and more about is that these things aren't always intentional. We don't always, we're not always planful and deliberate in what we implement as reinforcement. These things can be inadvertent. And this is where we're going to start talking more about understanding the cycles that we get into of where things might be inadvertently being reinforced, particularly around the negative reinforcement, because this is how we can get stuck into traps. Before we talk about that, though, we're going to go flip to the other side and talk about punishment, so discipline, or well, I guess not even discipline, because we're talking the really sort of behavioral learning definition of the word, where punishment, if something is a punisher, it decreases the likelihood of behavior happening again. And positive punishment, once again, this is not good punishment or bad punishment. It's punishment that involves adding something into the environment after a particular behavior. So an example of this, you have a kid who's caught copying from their friend, or cheating on a test or whatever. And so a very obvious one saying, that goes against our school rules. You're going to have to stay in for a detention at lunchtime. And so what's happened, the behavior, the copying or the cheating is followed by adding something into the environment, a detention. You have to stay in class by yourself, or not playing with your friends. As a result of that, the idea being that behavior will go down if that child experiences that as unpleasant. And that's the key thing, right? What is this child experiencing as unpleasant? Because not all kids will. Another example, you have a kid who starts a fight with another student because that student is playing with what they want to play with, and they would give them a turn, blah, blah, blah. And so then what happens is that, these physical altercations aren't okay. You have to let the parents of the kid know. So there's a phone call home. For lots of children, the idea that their parents were called by their teacher is very punishing. They experience that as very unpleasant, and that behavior theoretically will go down. But once again, not all kids will experience this particular discipline strategy as punishment. They won't care, it won't affect them. And so the extent to which that actually reduces that behavior is going to be really contingent on whether that particular unpleasant outcome is actually unpleasant for the child. Last example here, I think, is that you have a kid who is being disruptive by talking loudly in class, interrupting others, being sort of annoying. And so what happens is that you put a cross next to their name on the board, or you move them from fire into not fire, or whatever it is. There's that sort of public display that they aren't sort of acting in the way that we would expect them to act. I think, like I said before, I would have found this incredibly punishing, because this would have been so unpleasant to me to have sort of my sort of me being sort of almost publicly put on display as someone who wasn't, following the rules. So for me, this would have decreased that particular behavior. But once again, not all kids experience this, shame response, embarrassment response to this. And so not all kids are going to experience this as unpleasant. And so it may not have the intended effect then of reducing down the behavior. And so I think we'll have a follow-on example of negative punishment for that particular type of child, where this is where a behavior happens and something pleasant is taken out of the environment, right? So in this example that we were talking about before, this is one of those kids where having their name on the board hasn't impacted, they haven't experienced that as unpleasant, so it hasn't impacted the behavior. And so once again, they continue being disruptive, they continue interacting, and so you go, okay, you've had 3 crosses next to your name on the board, or whatever, means that you no longer, you've lost the right to go and play soccer at lunchtime. And this kid loves playing soccer, lives for lunchtime soccer. And so for this particular kid, that particular discipline strategy has functioned in the way we want punishment to function, because something pleasant, something that this kid experiences as pleasant, as a good thing, has been removed from their environment. So that's been the thing that has had the impact on the frequency of the behavior happening again. Another example of negative punishment, kid continues to play on the iPad after you've told them that it's time to turn off and put back on the docks. And so then an example of like a logical consequence here, you say, okay, well, tomorrow during iPad time, you're not allowed to have the free play on the iPad. So you've taken out of the environment something that the child experiences as positive, and hopefully that the theory is that that will reduce behaviour in future. Argy-bargy happens on the playground. This is the fourth time that it's happened, and so things really escalate. The teacher, principals decide that this child is no longer allowed to attend the disco. This kid was really looking forward to the disco, and so that is something pleasant being removed from the environment, negative punishment, the idea being that that will reduce the frequency of the behavior. So, little summary thing there that you can have a look at just to remind yourselves when you get the slides. But basically, the idea being that when a child does something and we respond in a particular way, that could affect the likelihood of that behavior happening again. But it might not have the intended effect, depending on whether the kid experiences something as pleasant or unpleasant. And things could be happening. We could be responding to things without being explicitly aware that those responses are shaping behavior. And it's not only our responses. Obviously, the kids around, the other people in the room, peers, other teachers are also going to be exerting these shaping effects.